This time, I had no idea what I was looking for because I didn't even know who I was going to do my project on this time. So I was walking around serving cunt with this fit, and I decided to check out the first floor, and I step off the elevator, and I get a blast from the past. I'm immediately transported back to the summer of 2023. I was in DC for something called the National Media and Journalism Conference, which is held by George Mason University. I was there for about 7 days in DC. One of the days we were able to spend exploring the National Mall. And so I spent majority of that time walking through the National Gallery of Art. Circling back to present day, this is the painting that I saw at Sama, which immediately reminded me of a painting that I saw in the National Gallery of Art, which is this painting here. Both paintings are very similar, just in the way that they're formatted. In the forefront, you have trees that are both off to the right side, and then in the front, you have obviously the lake, which makes this oval shape on the shore that you're seeing. And then in the background, you have these very dramatic, tall, sort of intimidating mountains. And it just reminded me of a similar painting that I saw over 2 years ago at this point. And I didn't know if they were by the same artist, but I had to find out. I found that both paintings were painted by a guy named Albert Bierstadt. He was a German American painter who was known for his landscapes of the American West, which is why these two paintings look quite similar. Is they're supposed to be depicted around the same area in California. This is the one that I saw at the National Gallery of Art. It's called Mount Corcoran. It was painted between 1876 and 1877. It depicts also the Sierra Nevada mountains when he was traveling through the West in the 1860s. This is the one that I saw in Sama. It is aptly named Passing Storm over the Sierra Nevadas, but it was painted earlier in 1870. In this painting, he dramatized the contrast of light and shadows while exaggerating the scale of the mountains. That was not an unusual thing for Bierstadt to do. He wanted to capture the grandeur and the magnificence of nature, even if it was more exaggerated. It was meant to captivate East Coast American and European audiences with scenes from the Wild West. I think the painting itself is beautiful, undoubtedly so. However, there was this element of haunting, I suppose, like this element of this darkness, and perhaps that comes from the contrast between the light and the shadow. But when I think of this, and I think that this is in California of all places, it feels like this is a piece out of time. Just how wild it is. These places still exist, but no longer in the same way anymore, just due to human settlement and industrialization and the like. And it is also hauntingly beautiful in the way in which I've seen art like this weaponized for rhetoric when talking about climate change. Bierstadt is still considered one of the greatest American landscape artists of today. He was a proponent of conservationism and sympathetic to the plight of Native Americans, but he never once questioned the doctrine of manifest destiny, nor did he decry their conditions. All he did was paint them and paint suffering, which objectively, the presence of suffering being depicted does not necessarily mean a challenge to the systems of oppression. By 1870, the South was already undergoing Reconstruction. The 15th Amendment had passed, granting black men the right to vote. Westward expansion was still under full swing. and majority of the West was still seen as wild, which a large part of it still very much was. The US military had more conflicts with Native Americans in the Great Plains, driving them further westward, and having more conflicts with settlers in the West. In the Critique of Judgment, Kant says, "The beautiful is that which, apart from the concepts, is represented as the object of a universal satisfaction." Basically, what's being said here is that a judgment of beauty is based on the harmony of our faculties. The harmony of our faculties produces a sensation of pleasure that we feel, which is what we perceiving the beauty. And for something to be beautiful, we therefore command a universal agreement, which I do for this painting. I think it's beautiful. If you don't think it's beautiful, then I don't know what to tell you. I describe it as hauntingly beautiful, not just for the contrast between light and shadow in the painting itself, but I think it more so represents the knowledge that I am burdened to carry as much of a gift as that knowledge is, whether it be the climate crisis due to global warming causing mass extinction for animals and human alike. As weather worsens, we will see large humanitarian crisis on scales we have not seen before. And on the other side of that coin, I feel there are people who feign to care about the climate or who do genuinely care about climate change, but then use that as justification to peddle eco-fascist talking points. In Walter Benjamin's The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, he says, "This is the situation of politics, which fascism is rendering aesthetic. Communism responds by politicizing art." Page 20. What Benjamin is saying here is that fascism seeks to glorify art as a spectacle to turn politics into a sort of ritual, as a way for the masses to express themselves without actually changing any of the underlying material conditions. Eco-fascists in particular, as it pertains to art, I believe they use images, or they can use artwork like passing storm over the Sierra Nevadas, demonstrating what the environment used to look like versus what it looks like now, and how it is so different because of human mismanagement. And that conclusion is not a wrong conclusion to draw to. However, eco-fascists come to the solution, which involves the acceptance of killing people for living on Earth to be sustainable for everybody else. And they do this by they pose themselves as environmentally conscious people because it is unsustainable with how we are living at the current moment. And you will hear them say things like, "Humans are a disease on the planet," or during COVID, when people were stuck inside because of the coronavirus, they would say, "Look, the planet is healing without people." And these statements come across as simplistic, nihilistic, and I think these these declarations are oversimplified to a degree where they can draw people in, but it repeating such rhetoric is much more sinister and has a lot more sinister implications, especially when the environmental movement has for a long time been intertwined with the overpopulation myth that somehow humans are overpopulating the planet, and that is why we are running out of resources, when the true answer is the overconsumption of resources by mainly Western nations, which is what is causing such pollution to occur. Not just the amount of people who exist, but the disproportionate amount of resources that people are using. And this overpopulation myth is purported by many people who say they are environmentalist. However, they only see humans as a problem instead of a solution to fighting climate change. And what that leaves them with is thinking that some losses are acceptable and necessary for us to sustainably live on the planet, which isn't true in the slightest. And that bridges into the conversation of A, both who is an acceptable loss, and B, how are they a necessary loss? Which, when we start categorizing human lives into who is necessary and who is acceptable to lose, that is where you get into a eugenicist conversation. That is where you get into a fascist conversation. So these nihilistic and these seemingly fringe ideas do have staying power, especially when people repeat them and do not know what the implication is of what they are saying. In class, we've talked about the use of dog whistles as a way for fascists to be able to communicate with each other while still having a sense of plausible deniability, while saying, like, oh, this is not actually what this means. Um, I think this in particular, when we're talking about comments about humanity being a disease or Earth healing, especially over COVID, when people were speaking about these things, I don't think a lot of the people who were liking or resharing those tweets or saying it themselves were or are ideologically committed to a fascist project. I genuinely think it is people say these things, majority of people say these things out of a sense of desperation and out of a sense of hopelessness that they feel for being unable to enact change in their immediate environment. And when they see catastrophic weather events multiple times a year all across the world because of the changing climate, it evokes that hopelessness within them to change anything. So they go for the seemingly desperate and the seemingly it is the easiest answer people come up with in the hyper individualistic society we live in. So I don't think it's that crazy of an answer for the late stage capitalist hellscape that we live in. And it is easier to imagine that than it is to imagine the end of capitalism, which would come with um, hopefully green peace. I don't think it's a lack of care. I think people don't know what they can do. And the biggest thing to fix this is telling people what they can do. And instead of becoming nihilistic and cynical and hopeless in the world we live in, we could tell them there are ways to organize themselves and their community to not only help fight against governments and corporations who are perpetuating the worst of climate crimes, shall I say, but that anger would be rightfully directed at the correct sources. So yes, that's why I think people think that way. And the best thing we can do for them is to redirect their anger and to empower people to do something.